Was pre-Astralis a super team? Because many people think they weren't, and some people realize that they were. And in this video, I'm going to convince you that they were a super team, and they started trying to form that super team not long after forming the roster in 2013. They did this by becoming the best team in Denmark, and then continually roster moving their way out of any downswing in performance. Now, between the years of 2010 to 2018, you might not have known, Astralis was actually the team at the time of the ranking, or soon after poached 11 out of the 13 Danish players that ever appeared in the top 20, including Nico, Xyp9x in 2013, Cajunb, Magisk, and even Zonic and Karrigan. And of the two players that they didn't pick up at any point, one of them was Config, which there's a story behind, and the second is a player that retired before Astralis ever even had their team. So really, there was only one player that didn't pick up. I believe Astralis was obviously a super team, and the main argument against seems to be just the narrative that Astralis was just good at teamwork is too juicy to pass up, and a lot of people just weren't aware of the Danish scene back in these times. This was a lot less studied in 2014 and 2015 compared to what it is today. Now, Astralis was amazing at teamwork, and they did a lot of things right, but that doesn't mean they weren't also stacked to the gills with talent. And not only this, they were amazing at teamwork long before they were the #1 team in the world, but the problem is nobody cares unless you have the skill to back it up. Now, to start with, I want to give you guys a definition, or my definition of super team, because a super team is a team made of star level talents joining forces to win. A super team doesn't all have to be from different rosters and launders. In fact, the most notable super team in history, the Golden State Warriors, developed 3 of their major talents. That's Clay, Curry, and Draymond Green. Then they placed second in the NBA in 2016 or 2015, I can't remember which. Then added 1 world-class player and unanimously became a super team. Keep that in mind. They came second, and then they upgraded, and everyone agreed they were a super team. In fact, they are the prototypical super team. Everyone agrees they're a super team. Now, to me, a super team is a combination of several factors at the outset of a roster. When it forms, is the individual skill, expectations of success, and throwing money at their problems. So it doesn't have to have all 3, but it can have 2 really strongly and avoid the other one, but it's a combination of the 3. So to begin with, Astralis, they were originally Copenhagen Wolves with this core. If we go back to 2013, Fetish, Kjaerbye, 3K2, Device, and Dupreeh. So we've got Device and Dupreeh on Copenhagen Wolves. They weren't actually the best team in Denmark at the time. The best team in Denmark at the time was Western Wolves, which was Gla1ve, MSL, Nico, Pimp, and Insta. Actually, it was Nilla at the time. But shortly into 2013, about the middle of 2013, Copenhagen Wolves became clearly the best team in Denmark, and there's a decent amount of people corroborating that. One of the things to keep in mind is that Denmark at the time should be kind of thought of like the French scene in pretty much the entire history of the French scene. Players just constantly swapped teams to different ones whenever they wanted. I guess there weren't buyouts, and they just constantly swapped teams. So to begin with, the first star poaching is Xyp9x. He got poached in July of 2020, or it's not 2023, 2013, from Fnatic. And at the time, Xyp9x was said by Thorin to be the shining star of an otherwise terrible Fnatic roster. And he had a 1.11 rating over the first 6 months of the year before being picked up by Copenhagen Wolves. And by the way, 1.11 rating 1.0. You can think of them as inflated by 0.05 in rating 2.0. So it's about a 1.16 rating as a rifler, which is a fantastic rating. And if you look at the team he was on, it was a ridiculous roster. It's Xyp9x, Freeze, Trace, Karrigan, and Madi. Okay, that was their roster to begin with. So think of this as a 1.16 rating, which is extremely good for a rifler. And he also manages to come number 20 of the year in 2013. So a lot of people don't realize that Xyp9x was a star player, a star signing. He definitely was. And at the same time as they picked up Xyp9x, they actually picked up the number 7 player of 2011, Freeze. Okay, at the exact same time as they picked up Xyp9x. Now, one of the other things they did a little bit later in the year is they picked up some other players. But sorry, let me get back on track here. In 2013, Astralis actually ended the year with 2 players in the top 20. So they had Xyp9x and Dupreeh. And there's actually a third player in the top 20, Nico, who's also Danish. And when you look at that, he also joined the roster in 2013, near the end of 2013 in November. So he was already having the 14th best player of the year. He was already well on track for that. He had an amazing year. And they picked him up during that year. So just another, just another quick star signing. And the roster ended up being Device, Dupreeh, Xyp9x, Fetish, and Nico. 3 players in the top 20. So at the end of 2013, they have 3 well-established top 20 players. And at the end of 2013, they also managed to lose their last game of the year to N Faculty. And Faculty is Cajunb, Pimp, Gla1ve, Rawls, and Karrigan. So it looks like it was previously Western Wolves. They had left Copenhagen Wolves at this point, so they were uber geeks. Cajunb carried this series. It's a 2-1 series. Cajunb absolutely carried, especially in the final map. And before the first game of 2014, Cajunb is picked up and he is on what is now Dignitas. So their very first game of the year, they've already picked up Cajunb to replace Nico. So they've upgraded the number 14 player to Cajunb, who also had insane stats this in 2013. The 1.14 rating correlated to about a 1.19 rating in rating 2.0, which is again insane for a rifler. I don't even know how he wasn't in the top 20. Interesting. It's an interesting question. I just thought it was hilarious that he's already on their team that quickly. But in any case, he's unhappy or whatever, and he does eventually leave the team not that long after, and they sign AZ to stand in. And then AZ does shit, and they sign Cajunb to replace him. Okay. So Cajunb comes back later. But in this period, 2014, as Dignitas, they were known as chokers. And they were like kind of a semifinal team. They were a top 4 team in this era. You could call them, this is their top 4 semifinal era. Thorin called them the guards of the top tier. As in they rarely lost to teams worse than them, but they didn't too often beat teams above them. But they were a top 4 team. At the end of the year, there's a bit of a downturn. You can see they're doing really amazing near the start. And then, as the year goes on, they start losing and coming a little bit lower ranked in each of the videos or each of the tournaments. And Thorin actually has a video, Dignitas and the Road to Nowhere, where he mentions that Fetish might not actually be that good of an IGL. Their T sides have 0 success, and it's typically their CT sides where they seem to do really well. And he says in this video specifically that if they don't come top 4 at DreamHack Winter, they should make some pretty drastic changes, which, by the way, they don't. In the same video, he also says he complains very specifically that Dignitas have all of the best talent in Denmark, and if they keep underperforming, they could literally disband and make 2 teams that are capable of winning instead of 1 team that just can't get past the semifinals. So then they do eventually place 5th to 8th at DreamHack Winter, and when you look at that, they drop Fetish and pick up Karrigan. Now, Fetish being dropped actually wasn't seen as that positive because Fetish was seen as one of the only players that wasn't choking very much on their team because they were already known as chokers. But one of the interesting things is, if you actually look through this, Gla1ve is already being talked about as someone that they could pick up to replace Fetish because he's had really good success on T side specifically, and he's a really good player. Someone even says Gla1ve has proven himself to be the most successful Danish IGLs in CSGO. People talked about Karrigan because Karrigan was a star player in CS 1.6 or Source or whatever he played, but he became an IGL in CSGO a little bit later. I think he was even an opper before he joined this roster to some extent. So he was actually another previous star player. But Karrigan wasn't actually seen as the greatest pickup of all time. But anyways, to end 2014, Device is already seen, and in the same video I showed earlier, Thorin says that if you ignore accomplishments because they hadn't won very much, Device is already a top 4 player of all time, which is an insane thing to have said at the end of 2014. But one of the other things he does Sorry, I know that comes later. And for 2014, the roster of Dignitas was Device, Dupreeh, Kjaerbye, Zipnix, and Fetish / Karrigan. They ended with 2 top 20 players. If you look at the top 20, 2014, they ended with Device as number 20 and Dupreeh as number 16. They're not a super team here, but again, they've made a lot of signings that were players that they basically were trying to solve their problems by signing new players. To begin 2014, they joined TSM. Why is this Astralis? To begin 2015, they joined TSM. God damn it. And they do really, really, really well in TSM. If you look at their results in 2015, they win a lot of events, just a fuckload of events, and come second in a lot more. And actually, in 2015, TSM was not only clearly the number 2 team in the world, basically hands down, but they had 16 top 4 placings compared to the 19 top 4 placings from Fnatic, who were widely considered to be the best team of all time in that era. So not only were they the second best team, they were also beating Fnatic a lot in group stages specifically, still seen as chokers, but Thorin calls them clearly the number 2 team in the world. And they actually end the year in 2015 with Device as number 3, Dupreeh as number 12, and Cajunb as number 15. So 3 players in the top 20. To start 2016, they actually end up joining Astralis. Sorry, let me check this. To start 2016, they end up joining Astralis. And Thorin actually makes a video here called Building the Danish Super Team near the beginning of 2016. And the reason he probably made that video is because if you look at the beginning of 2016, compared to their time in TSM, they didn't do nearly as well. They were starting to have a bit of a downturn. So in this video, he says specifically that Astralis clearly have the best players in Denmark in every position. They have the best player in Denmark in every position, and many of the best players in the world. He also specifically says that Zipnix is one of the best support players in the world, despite not being in the top 20. So despite only having 3 players in the top 20, they do have a player that is a star, theoretically, for his role. Now, Thorin says his Danish super team would be Device, Dupreeh, Zipnix, and he would replace Karrigan with MSL, because Thorin loves MSL, and Cajunb with Kjaerbye. That is, replace the number 15 player in the world with Kjaerbye. And they would play under Astralis because they have the prestige that other Danish players will join them, which is true. They have all the money, direct quote, and that they already had some of the best players in the world. And in this video, Thorin even calls Device and Dupreeh.
Because Dupreeh and Device, they are the 1-2 punch, the GetRight and the Forest of the Danish scene. I mean, you have to realize this.
So they're the GetRight and the Forest of the Danish scene. They're insanely good. So they were underperforming in the beginning of 2016. So what are they going to do? Right? Typical Astralis. They've done this a bunch of times before. If you've been following the results, they drop a player and replace him with the best player on the rival Danish team. They replace him with Kjaerbye, who at the time was carrying. So if we look at Cajunb's stats, this is the number 15 player of the year, by the way, 1.06 rating, which is good for rating 1.0, but they replace him with Kjaerbye, who was absolutely a star at the time. And they poached him off of Dignitas, which turned into North later, which was their biggest rival in the Danish scene. And if you look at the comments at the time, people are pretty much confused because of the whole player-owned org thing. This is like shortly after they formed Astralis, right? But if you look at it, one of the comments that I think is most telling is this one, where he says, Kjaerbye will either keep being on form, making Astralis a top 3 team in the world, even though they were already number 2 the previous year, okay? Or since Astralis has so many stars, he'll be unable to play like he did on Dignitas, making them worse. This is exactly the type of quote you see when someone makes a super team. Will their players be able to perform at the same level, joining together, or did they need the support of their team to allow them to be stars? This is the first move which I believe fully obviously makes Astralis a super team. They were the number 2 team in the world. They upgraded the number 15 player in the world for someone that was carrying another roster outside of them, and everyone seems to understand that this is a star signing. Basically saying he's a star in a sea of other stars on this roster. Thorin also made a video on this move, by the way, and he said Cajunb was right to be removed, Kjaerbye was amazing and should have been picked up, and he specifically calls Kjaerbye a star player. So again, this is where Astralis, to me, clearly become a super team. After this pickup, they do well for a while. So this is March or so. They do pretty well for a while, but then they start to have yet another downturn. One of the things that happens during this period is that they play in the major and they come 5th to 8th, which doesn't seem like very much, but actually Gla1ve was a stand-in at this major because I believe there was some health issues with Device or Dupreeh or something. And at this major, they come 5th to 8th. In the quarterfinals against Virtus Pro, they take Virtus Pro to overtime in both games with 2 fucking stand-ins. They have Gla1ve and they have their coach Zonic standing in. They definitely would have made the semifinals at least if they didn't have 2 stand-ins. But I mean, how much teamwork could you possibly have when you have 2 stand-ins? This has to be your star players being star players. And Gla1ve in this event has a 1.10 rating. It looks like this is rating 2.0, so you don't have to inflate that. But looking at the stats, he's pretty fucking good. So again, Astralis supposedly without many star players or individual talent placed in the quarterfinals. But the question is, who is Gla1ve at this time? Is he someone known? I mentioned before that he was talked about as a potential replacement for Fetish, but he seemed to have some personality conflicts. There was the girlfriend getting kicked out because of his girlfriend situation, although there's a lot more to that. And some people I've seen argue that he was in the right. I didn't want to do that much research. So if we look at his most recent team beforehand, like his most recent long-term team, May 2015 to June, so it's over a year instead of like Heroic, he was with them for a couple months. If we look at Copenhagen Wolves, you're going to see he had a 1.09 rating, and this is probably going to be rating 1.0. That's a fucking insane rating for an IGL, right? It's about a 1.1 rating over a year. It was over a year where he had this rating. But not only that, he does even better against top 20 and top 30 teams. He's actually improving when he plays better teams. 1.3 rating against top 20 opponents. This is fucking wild to run this high, this ridiculously high of a rating against top 20 teams. That's like genuinely almost unheard of. Not only that, but Pimp in his AMA in 2015, November 2015, he doesn't look like he likes Gla1ve. Disagreements aside, there's not point denying the fact that he's incredible. By far the smartest player I've ever played with and watched play, and I consider the biggest wasted talent of all time in CSGO. So Gla1ve, not a no-name. People just really weren't following the Danish scene at the time, in my opinion. And he, by the way, just as an aside, the Danish scene was considered by many to be the best scene in the world at the time. So they've got all the best players in the Danish scene on one team in every role, and the Danish scene is the best or arguably the best scene in the world at the time. You can see how this is being built up. Okay, so they do replace Karrigan with Gla1ve. I actually cannot find a thread in which it's really weird. I can't find a thread on Gla1ve getting replaced with Karrigan. But one comment I've seen about it is that Thorin, before the replacement actually happened, had already said that it seemed like Astralis had lost faith in Karrigan, and I remember that being right about the narrative at the time. So it looked like Karrigan needed to be replaced, and Gla1ve had already played a few events, I think more than one event, with Astralis and done insanely well with them, so there's no reason not to pick him up. Now, to begin 2017, Astralis start off doing really well. They win the major, literally. But for the remainder of the year, it's slightly better than their 2016, but it's not like some amazing blowout year. You know, they're getting a lot of 4th, some 5th, 6th, and if you look at 2016, which was a failure of a year, people say Karrigan couldn't do shit with the Astralis core, which is not really true, but he did have a down year here, and if you look at this year, this is kind of a down year. I mean, winning the major is huge, but they don't do all that well afterwards. And not only that, they bomb out of the E-League Major 12th to 14th. Okay, so they're underperforming. Guess what's going to happen, guys? They're not going to cut someone. Kjaerbye's going to leave. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention, by the way, I actually think Kjaerbye carrying them, he gets the major MVP in the E-League Major 2017. I actually think this could be the start of Device and the rest of Astralis not having this choking issue, because if you look at this, Device did real poorly in this whole series. He's the worst rated player on their team, and on Train, which is an Opera's paradise, he doesn't do very well either. He's in the negative KD. But Kjaerbye backpacks this team, and honestly, this might be them getting over their choking problems. I just kind of thought that was kind of interesting how good Kjaerbye is in this tournament. However, Kjaerbye for the rest of the year is not really actually doing all that well. If we look after the major, he's only got a 1.04 rating. This is rating 2.0. Second worst on the team, only above Gla1ve. And not only that, but he's actually got some role overlaps with Dupreeh that has been talked about a lot. So I actually think the writing was on the wall to some extent, but that's just my opinion. Or no, wait, it's not just my opinion, because Zonic says in an interview with Thorin that Kjaerbye was probably going to get cut.
There is a good chance that Kjaerbye would have been swapped.
Because of the Dupreeh thing with the roles and stuff.
The same year later, yes, because I think role-wise, I saw more potential in Dupreeh, and I think...
So role-wise, he saw more potential in Dupreeh, and they were probably eventually going to make a roster move, and so Kjaerbye was probably going to get cut eventually. So then we go on to the replacement. The replacement, Magisk. A lot of people think he was just some random no-name. He was actually the number 14 actually player in 2016. And he joins Astralis in 2018. So he's not some random no-name. He's actually got history and was a hard carry of this Dignitas roster for a decent period of time. He was a really, really, really good player. He wasn't just some unproven no-name. And statistically, by almost every metric, he was better than Kjaerbye for 2017. So if we look at, this is 2017 until just before he got picked up, by Astralis. He's got a 1.13 rating. Kjaerbye, a little bit less if you look at all of 2017, but if you look at the same date period after the major, after they win that major, up until he leaves, it's even worse. So it seems like Magisk is probably definitely a better player, or statistically a better player. He's definitely seemingly to be a star. The question is, why wasn't he in the top 20? That's a reasonable question. If Kjaerbye wasn't number 15, and by the way, on their team they have number 15 Kjaerbye, number 13 Xyp9x, number 10 Dupreeh, and number 5 Device. So everyone but their IGL is in the top 15. But somehow Magisk is performing better than Kjaerbye. Well, if you look at Magisk's history here, he actually gets cut from North after the major, and he's got 2 months where he's without a team before he eventually joins this ridiculous mixed roster in Optic with Mixwell, Alu, HS, and Freiburg, and it's being called the budget phase in the middle, near the end of 2017, and he takes a little while to get integrated into the lineup. I think if he didn't have this 2-month downtime, there's a pretty good chance, you can see he plays again in October 1st, last one in July 21st. So if they didn't have this 2-month downtime, I feel like there's probably a pretty good chance he's in the top 20, and people would know a lot more about him nowadays, because when you only look at the top 20, he's not there in 2017. Was he that good? Yes, he was. He was that good. He was a very good player. But he did get cut from this North team, right? He did get cut, and Config was on that roster. So, you can feel free to question that if you want. But we'll get back to that. We'll get back to that in a second. So to reiterate, a top 3 team in 2017 with 4 players in the top 15 is being talked about upgrading their team by removing the number 15 player in the world and picking up Config. Sorry, I meant to look at this thread here. So if we look at Config in this thread, disappointed reactions, he left, and so people are very surprised by this. But a lot of people are talking about how this could be basically a blessing in disguise if they pick up Config. Config, please. Maybe Astralis is making moves to get Config. If Astralis can get Config, Kjaerbye leaving will be a blessing in disguise. Config would be sick on Astralis, would bring life into the team. Config is clearly a star player, and a lot of people are actually say that if they pick up Config, it's going to be a super team. But instead, they picked up Magisk. Now, Magisk is a lot less known, but one of the things you'll see in the thread where they do pick up Magisk, this is Magisk getting announced, is that how good is he? Is he better than Config? Because he was on this like Optic team. He wasn't really seen all that much. That's probably why he wasn't in the top 20, because he was kind of a little bit not on such a high profile team. He's a lot consistent, similar skill. I think Config has a higher peak. People will say generally that Magisk is about the same level as Config, who, by the way, if we go back to the top 20, Config was the number 14 player. So one slot above Kjaerbye on a worse team. So people will generally tell you that Config was about the same skill level as Magisk, but that doesn't necessarily make it an upgrade. However, if we actually ask Zonic one more time, what does he think?
What about, look, it didn't end up happening, but there's a world where Config might have been the 5th player. Listen, that'd be an interesting project for you to work with. Like, if anyone could get through to him, maybe it's you. Maybe you could have got to him.
Yeah, I mean, I think Magisk didn't have the best reputation. Like, the North guys kicked him, even though he was probably the best player on the roster at that time. And I think
so. The North players kicked him, even though he was probably the best player on the roster at that time. So to reiterate, a top 3, maybe arguably top 4 team in 2017, but I think they were the number 3 team with 4 players in the top 15. Drop their number 15 ranked player to pick up someone that Zonic, their coach, thinks is better than the number 14 ranked player. So they might even arguably have 4 or 3 players in the top 10. Which, by the way, is even more than Current Astralis has. Current Astralis has number 9, 11, 15, and 16. That's Current Astralis. Everyone seems to agree that that's a super team. But somehow, number 5, number 10, 13, and 15, or even an upgrade from 15, isn't a super team. I'm not sure that logic is being particularly consistent in my mind, but that's me. So basically, to summarize, Copenhagen Wolf starts with Device and Dupreeh as 2 of the players that will later be Astralis. By the middle of 2013, they're the best team in Denmark, where they pick up Xyp9x, a player already on track to be the number 20 player as a star carrying a pretty weak roster in 2013. The end of 2013, they end the year with 3 players on their team in the HLTV top 20, and they're the best team in Denmark. Almost every time this team has a downturn in form, they replace player after player after player with the best players in the world, with some of the best players in the world. Definitely the best player on their in Denmark that's not on their team. Pretty much every single time, it's the best player not on their team in Denmark, because they have the pick of the litter, and Denmark is like France roster shuffle situation. Almost every time they have a downturn in form, until eventually they have a roster that has one of the best players in the world, all of the best players in Denmark in every role, and at this point, as TSM 2015, they then replace one of their star players with someone that's an even bigger star from their biggest rival to upgrade from a team that already had 3 players in the top 20 in the previous year and a top 5 IGL and top 5 support in the world. Then they have another downturn in form and replace their IGL with an IGL that had a bad reputation but was already performing potentially top 20 caliber just individually, but on and off due to personality conflicts and whatever problems, he had a collapsed lung and some other stuff. They win a major with this roster, and shortly after having 4 players in the top 15 for 2017, shortly after, they upgrade from the number 15 player in the world for a player that was not only better, but avoided the role overlaps of the previous player. Astralis was clearly a super team. You really can't deny it unless you don't know much about the Danish scene, or you're so addicted to the narrative that Astralis was just really good teamwork, as if they didn't also have insane star power. And they didn't already have that insane teamwork in 2013 and 2014, which, by the way, they were my favorite team at this time. I watched them. Their utility was incredibly precise and very good mid-round decision-making in terms of supporting each other. these are just narratives that people are stuck to. I think if you look at the facts, it's very clear that Astralis was a super team. After they picked up Kjaerbye, arguably picking up Gla1ve would have turned them into a super team even from there, and certainly picking up Magisk in 2018 turned them into a super team again. I mean, after Kjaerbye, but if you don't think after Kjaerbye, after Gla1ve, arguably, and if you don't think after Gla1ve, after Magisk, absolutely. There is a question of whether or not only picking up one player constitutes a new roster, but if that's true, then FaZe 2022 and even 2024 isn't a super team, which generally everyone seems to agree that FaZe was most likely a super team, although I argue with for or against that. But again, the most famous super team of all time replaced one player, and that turned them into a super team, so I think it's hard to argue that replacing one player isn't enough to turn you into a super team. Astralis regularly tried to fix their problems by spending, and actually, by the way, one of the things I forgot to even mention, Magisk, the reason he wasn't talked about in these threads when people were talking about, oh, they can replace Kjaerbye with Config, is because Config was a little more obvious, but also Magisk has just been signed by Optic, which is a big money NA brand. People don't usually think you can buy a player, a star player, off of an NA team, and he had recently come out saying he was very happy with Optic. Okay, so that is them throwing money at Optic, probably a lot of money, to poach their best player and bring him to their team.